So if you've spent some amount of time looking into how to study a language, the chances are that you've come across the term immersion. For those of you who don't know, it is simply forcing yourself to hear only your target language. The idea is that this will lead to you learning your target language just by picking up individual words and not having the opportunity to opt into using your own native language. This is an attempt at learning a language essentially the same way that kids learn their first language, and it is a great idea in principle, but especially for adults, it doesn't always work out that way in practice. An example of how it could look for an adult is, for instance, I spent 4 weeks in Brazil visiting my girlfriend. For the entire time that I was there, I was in a country where essentially the only language that I could really use to communicate would be Portuguese, right? Yet, one thing that I discovered was I wasn't really studying that much more than I would have had I simply been staying at home in Norway. Instead of being out around people, interacting with them, I would find myself stuck in the apartment watching YouTube videos or simply playing games, right? And it doesn't really lead to immersion. At times I would go out and buy stuff from the shopping mall or something like that, but aside from those times, I wasn't really interacting with anyone aside from my girlfriend when she came back from work. Of course, I managed to get a lot of practice in just by talking to my girlfriend, and I was able to do that a lot more than I'm able to do now that I'm back in Norway. But you'd think that I would have been studying the entire day since I was visiting a country full of people using my target language, right? But the reason why I didn't do that was that I still didn't have any people to interact with while I was there, aside from my girlfriend. But she was working like 8 hours a day, which meant that she was gone for 9 hours of the day. I think that one of the biggest challenges for people that either travel to a country where they speak the language that they're studying or actually move there. I think that one of the biggest challenges for people traveling to a new country to study, or for people just visiting a country for a month or something like that, like how I did, is that they don't really have a lot of people to practice with. Especially if they're traveling with friends, they're much more likely to spend their time talking to those friends than to be out talking with strangers. In my case, I didn't really feel that comfortable going out talking to strangers while I was traveling, and I didn't really have the opportunity either. I didn't bother downloading an app like Uber, and I also didn't get a bus pass, which meant that my opportunities to get around the city was scarce at best. Like, I was essentially just stuck at home in the apartment. Even when I was out sightseeing with my girlfriend, I wasn't really interacting with a lot of Brazilians, aside from her, as you can imagine. And I mean, therefore, I didn't really get that much interacting. But as you can imagine, this would have been even worse if you were traveling with your friends that also spoke your native language. Like, if I was traveling with a bunch of Norwegian friends, I wouldn't really have had to use my Portuguese much at all, because I would be talking to them the entire day. Of course, I would be out a lot more traveling with them, but still, even with that, I would have probably not really had to use my Portuguese much at all, aside from like talking to people in stores and such. I don't really see myself having to use the language at all. So even with that little bit of interacting with that you have to do to get around in Brazil, it definitely wouldn't be enough to learn the language if I didn't already know how to speak Portuguese. Of course, I'm still improving, but I essentially already know how to speak Portuguese, right? Now, in my case, I have a day-to-day routine here in Norway that relies a lot on language. I work as a teacher, and I have activities that I do during my free time, right? Both of these mean that I have to interact with people, and naturally, I use Norwegian to do so. Even if I didn't know how to speak Norwegian that well, I would still have to interact with people in Norwegian during a normal day. If I had actually managed to get into some sort of routine in Brazil, working at a job where I had colleagues that I interacted with, I would have learned a lot more. Obviously, this isn't that easy to do, but setting yourself up with activities that you like. For instance, I really enjoy Ultimate Frisbee, and so if I could have found a way to practice that with people in Brazil, I would have had a lot more opportunities to strike up a conversation about pretty much anything, or at least the sport, right? So my suggestion is therefore that if you travel with the idea of getting in immersion, that you then decide that you'll be getting your immersion through some sort of specific method. Like, decide how you're going to be interacting with people. Decide how you are going to be finding the people that you can practice with. There is this YouTube channel called Matt vs. Japan, where an American, at least I think is American, I don't actually know, I didn't check. I probably should have. But he has spent a bunch of time studying Japanese, and he's now at a level where he can actually trick natives into thinking that he's also from Japan. At least until they see his face, because he does not look like he's Japanese. Some of his time was spent in Japan, but what he quickly realized, even while in Japan, was that he was learning way more from just sitting in his room, studying with books and watching anime than he would have learned if he tried to force himself to go out and talk to native Japanese people. It sounds counterintuitive, but he was learning way more just stuck in his room. Now, I want to do this again at some point, but if I'm going to be doing it successfully, then I should be setting up some sort of routine that lets me consistently interact with people all throughout my day. And these people, they have to be actual speakers of the language. They don't necessarily have to be natives, but they have to be speakers of the language so that I get to practice. How I'm going to be doing that, I haven't figured out just yet, but it could be through the sport that I like the most, or it could be while working as a teacher. Now, like I said in a previous video, I have no current plans to move to another country, much less Brazil, so I don't know how feasible it would be to get a job working as a teacher for a month, especially close to Salvador, which is where I would most likely want to travel right now if I was to travel to Brazil again. Now, bottom line is that if I was to spend a month in Brazil again, I think I would end up learning a lot more if I could set up some sort of routine like that, where I was interacting with people in the language. Now, despite me not having any plans to go visit Brazil again in the immediate future, I still think it would be interesting to hear what sort of routines you guys would suggest. So if you have any suggestions, if you know of any groups that are easy to get into as a foreigner, especially if there are foreigners watching this video, then please leave a suggestion for how you would do that. And who knows, I might really enjoy the idea, and that might be how I study Portuguese the next time I go visit. So that was, those were essentially my ideas for how I would do it, but what you would end up doing could be completely different. But just know that if you're traveling with the idea of learning a language, then you need to actually find, and you need to actually consistently find people to interact with. Now, that's all for this video, so best of luck with your studies, and neck out.